Okay, so we're moving on now to book two, and I'll try and keep this brief. Um, there's a couple of really important things that we need to cover, and I'll let you go because I think the lectures this week have been a little longer than usual. So there are two different kinds of virtues, the intellectual virtues and the moral virtues, or the virtues of character, as our translation has it. Um, the difference is, well, can be put a number of different ways. One of the big differences is that you develop the intellectual virtues by going to college, right? And studying math and working hard in your classes. That's the development of wisdom and like math skills and this sort of thing. Those are intellectual virtues. The moral virtues, on the other hand, you got to go to the school of life and you've got to experience the world and you have to make an effort at being morally excellent, right? To practice justice, you have to practice courage, you have to practice generosity in order to become generous or to perfect our capacities in our moral capacity with respect to the specific virtues. Um, Note that he points out that none of the virtues of character arises in us by nature. Intellectual virtues kind of arise in us by nature. Um, I mean, there are things that you can do to get the most out of what you got intellectually, and you can certainly develop your intellectual powers or virtues, right? But there are kind of innate limits too, right? I think of like I'm a pretty slow reader, right? And my wife, on the other hand, can just like glance at like paragraphs sometimes and like boom, she knows it, and I'm like still on the third sentence or whatever. Um, we both work really hard. She's, just always going to be better at that particular intellectual virtue, or at least the set of intellectual virtues that are operative in reading. I don't know. And so there are limits that are innate. Um, Moral virtues, on the other hand, you it's kind of much more of an equal setting for everyone. You know, it depends on you've got the capacity. It depends on what you do to perfect it through, as we'll see, habituation. I wanted to make another point here about the word virtue as it is translated in our text. The Greek word is arete, and I want you to know this Greek term, arete. Arete really means excellence. In English, most of the time, we use the word virtue specifically for what are here called the virtues of character or moral virtues. And that's what we think of when we think of virtue most of the time in English. But what it really means is excellence or excellency. A virtue is an excellency. So intellectual excellence, right? We develop that by going to school and studying and being taught, right? And we become an excellent student. We become excellent at mathematics. Virtue means excellence. Well, similarly, for the moral virtues, just excellence. We become morally excellent by acquiring the virtues. Um, it's the same word in Greek that we would use if we were talking about someone who is an excellent guitarist. If you played the guitar really well, you're excellent at it. It wouldn't sound so right in English to talk about someone who is a virtuous guitarist, right? But in Greek, it would be the same word. So always keep in mind when you're reading Aristotle that virtue really means, literally in the text, excellence. So we're talking about morally excellent, trying to become a morally excellent human being. Again, doing the human thing well, in fact, doing it excellently is being virtuous. I've already said this, but we're not born virtuous. Little babies and young children are not virtuous. They're not morally excellent human beings yet, but they have the capacity to acquire the virtues. Babies and young children, even maybe teenagers. I don't know when do you get the virtues. It takes a complete life, as we saw, right? In the previous slides. So we're born with the capacity for virtue, and then we develop them or bring them to completion or perfection through habituation. And that means getting ourselves into situations that call for the close discrimination of how to behave, how to act in that situation, and practicing, literally, like trying to get it right over and over again until it becomes a part of you, becomes a habit. And also, being good will eventually feel good through habituation. It's also how we become vicious, right? By doing the opposite of virtue. If we act like a coward all the time in situations that we get ourselves in that call for courage, well, then we're going to become cowardly. So this is the doctrine of the mean, or at least one nice, short little uh, expression of it in the text. The doctrine of the mean is just that the virtues are always the mean, or the middle, right, between extremes of excess and deficiency. And this will make more sense when I get the chart of the virtues up here for you in a moment. And if you've already downloaded the chart that I had for you online, you can have that out maybe right now. But so the virtues, say, of courage or temperance or what have you, if you avoid and fear everything, never stand your ground, you become cowardly. How do you become courageous? Well, by standing your ground. And that means running the risk, as it were, of missing the mark, right? Maybe you really, and every time, every situation is different, right? And so when you get into a different situation, you try to do the courageous thing. And maybe you didn't quite make it, but if you got your head in the game, so to speak, and you're thinking it through, then the next time you're in a situation, albeit it's going to be different, that calls for courage, you might get better at it only if you use practical reason to determine the mean, the sweet spot between excess and deficiency, right? There's that sweet spot, and you find it by using practical reason in situations that call for the virtues, by trying to be good. And that develops the habit of virtue, and it perfects your character. Now, that doesn't mean that it perfects it like you're going to be some, perfect angel or something and always know exactly what to do. But you perfect it in the sense of bringing it to completion, right? Perfection here doesn't mean like morally perfect in the way that we think of it. It means perfection in the sense of completion, right? Yeah, that's maybe too complicated for you. But yeah, so we become vicious or full of vice, right? The same way we become virtuous by doing vicious things. If we want to be good, we got to do good things. Because if we do the bad thing, it will drag us down, and then we'll develop the habits of vice, and then the vice will start to feel good, right? And then we're just slippery slope all the way to the bottom. And Aristotle's point here is that it will ruin your life, right? You seek pleasure, and you start to become sort of weak-willed with respect to pleasure. It's going to start to snowball, and it can get out of control. And the worst situation, the most tragic, would be someone who is living a vicious life and doesn't even know it. Because unless you sort of tasted the life of virtue, you don't even know what you're missing. This is sort of Aristotle's perspective here. If you practice the virtues, it's its own reward, and it's the reward that you get in this life. So, chapter 2 of book 2 has the famous passage, or has the famous doctrine of the mean, where Aristotle tells us that the virtue, moral excellency, is to be found in the mean between the extremes of vice. So there are always the virtue is always flanked by vices. And the trick is to work every day for the rest of your life. You don't get to let up on it, right? To work at finding where that mean is between the extremes. Now, it's not an arithmetic mean. It's not like math where it's a perfect average between the two. But better to think of the mean as the sweet spot. It's what you're supposed to do, and you got to find it, right? You've got to figure it out. I think there's pretty good sports analogies appropriate here, right? Finding the sweet spot. You got to, if you play baseball, you got to hit it just right to get that. You got to hit it with the sweet spot of the bat. And how do you do that? You work at it and you develop muscle memory and habits, right? Until you become a really excellent slugger, right? Where you're, boom, home run. So the moral life is like that for Aristotle. You've got to find the sweet spot. And you can't just assume that, people aren't born virtuous. They have to practice virtue in order to be good at it. And after a while, just like when you are playing a musical instrument or playing a sport, when you get good at it, it also feels good, and it's something that you enjoy, and it makes life, as Aristotle puts it, choice-worthy, right? So moral virtue, because it has that sense of it makes life choice-worthy, makes life go well, right? The moral virtues do. The mean is relative to us, and it is not obtained automatically, right? So for 10 pounds of food, so the mean is different for different people. He again uses this kind of a sports example, right? I mean, you're playing football, you're going to have a different diet prescribed by your trainers, as it were, than if you were playing some other sport. And different people are going to be given a different diet prescribed because their body, their build, or whether they're working out, whether they're lifting weights, or whether they're a runner, or whether they're, it's going to be different for different people. The same thing with the sweet spot in virtue. It's going to be different for different people. So we shouldn't expect, again, as he says in the beginning of this treatise on the moral life, that we shouldn't expect exactness like we get in the exact sciences, right? We shouldn't expect a mathematical mean where virtue is between extremes of vice. Yeah, it's rough to figure out how much is too much, how much is too little. To have them at the right time, say the right feelings, to feel the right feels, at the right times, the right things, towards the right people, for the right end, in the right way. That's the mean. That is excellent to be able to do that. Feel the right feels when you're doing the right thing. It's rough, and it takes a lifetime, but per Aristotle, totally worth it. All right, so here's a handy table of virtues. It's important to point out that for Aristotle, the virtues are really always unified. There's his doctrine of the unity of the virtues. That is, you can't work on one or fail at one. You can't work on one without working on all of them at once. All the virtues are in play at any given time. And for a number of reasons. One is that a person's character has to have a unity to it. And these are the virtues of character. But also, it just kind of makes sense that courage, it might take courage to be truthful or honest. So in many situations you might say, well, is truthfulness or honesty really the virtue that I'm practicing here, or is it being courageous and telling the truth in this situation that is really called for? In fact, both of them are, and in fact, all of them are. Although certain situations are such that one virtue usually takes center stage, right? Is more salient. That is, it sticks out more obviously in a given situation. So this is dividing them up into a number of virtues is purely a heuristic reason. It's just for teaching purposes, right? So it's useful, but keep in mind that really they're always in play in every situation. All of them are in play in every situation. Similarly, if you fail at the virtues, or you're not using practical reason to determine the mean between the extremes of vice, you're also harming your ability to be excellent in all the other regions of your moral life, right? At any rate, we use courage a lot here, but let's look at one of the virtues. But start, in fact, with the sphere of action or kind of situation. Um, we can use, which one should we use? Let's use friendliness, social conduct. This involves our attitude towards others. Let's think about a boss, right? We don't want to be rude, say, to our coworkers. We want to be friendly. But we don't want to be obsequious. There's a word to click on and add to your card if you don't know it already. Obsequious, like kind of a fawning, overly friendly, almost slavish kind of attitude towards someone. Usually, we probably all know people who do this, especially when it involves a work situation. But obsequiousness, the uh, another term for it that you're perhaps more familiar with would be kissing ass, right? Someone who's obsequious is kind of a uh, yeah, that's what that means. But you also don't want to be rude and just ignore people, right? You want to be a friendly human being. So we can think of situations that might call for that virtue of friendliness. Similarly, responding to insults. If someone insults you, Aristotle here is saying, well, you don't want to not be angry, right? I mean, you should be angry if someone insults you, but you also need to practice the virtue of patience. Irascibility is what you might, haul off and slug somebody because they insulted you somehow, right? Maybe you just need to be patient with it. A coworker does something to piss you off and you're justified in being angry. But he's not telling you don't be angry, but hold back, you know? Think it through. Also, you shouldn't be apathetic. That is, we kind of don't care, like, oh, I don't care. No, you should be mad if it calls for it. But you should also be patient. And so forth, with truthfulness, proper pride, proper ambition, generosity, temperance, courage, modesty, and wittiness. Now, there's an awkward one here, and that is the third from the bottom, indignation at others' undeserved good fortune, that sphere of action. But I invite you to read the footnote on this in the handout that I have online if you're interested in discussing that one. At any rate, you see how easy it would be to invent a circumstance or situation for each of these spheres of actions and tell me how a truly virtuous person you think would act in that given situation. It's a common essay question for the final exam in this course. All right, final few things about virtue. It's a state of being. It's a state involving rational choice consisting in a mean relative to us determined by reason. It's important that reason is in play here because that's our special thing for the kind of thing that we are, our rationality. And so that's why the moral virtues count as an expression of our characteristic function as a human being. Why it's human excellence and not divine nor animal or non-human animal. Not every action admits of a mean. You don't get to say, well, I want to make sure it's just enough adultery, right there in the sweet spot between too much and too little, right? Or, some things are just depraved. And, homicide and theft. Like, I stole a little bit, just the right amount between too much stealing or too, homicide is perhaps the most crazy, right? You want to make sure you kill just the right amount, not too many and not too few, right? Those are always, by definition, an excess. They name vices, right? Why is it so hard to be good? Pause it, read this for yourself. I ask a question about this a lot in the exams for this class, so know it. Maybe give me an example if you can. Finally, a couple more things, right? Um, the vices aren't all equal. Some vices are worse than others, is what he's getting at here. And if you think of courage, well, when people err on the side of in the virtue of courage, they generally don't err on the side of rashness, although it can happen. Usually, people err on the other side, and there's reasons for it. It has to do with a lot of things. But so some are worse than others. Some are greater at that, farther away from the mark, farther away from the right thing than others. Um, And also, individuals are particularly prone to certain vices because of the way we were raised, because of just our natural temperament. We might be more given to anger, so irascibility is going to be a problem, right? More of a problem for me than it is, say, for my wife, who's like always chill or whatever, right? People are different. We have different temperaments. We have different proclivities, different habits, different backgrounds, upbringing, and so forth. And so we're going to be prone to different errors in the moral life, which means we have to know where we stand in this way. We have to pay attention to ourselves and be honest with ourselves, as it were. I'm going to leave you with this thought from the god Apollo, or supposedly it's from him. This is the picture of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. Delphi and the Temple of Apollo in particular were considered by the Greeks to be the navel of the world, navel of the cosmos, the belly button of the universe, so to speak. And it's where the god Apollo, who was, among other things, the god of prophecy, would speak to the Greek people through his priests and priestesses, right? And on the temple at Delphi were two moral principles that form the background, or the backbone, really, of Greek moral thought, including Aristotle's. And that is, nothing too much and know thyself. If you think about it, the doctrine of the mean, Aristotle's telling us, nothing to excess, don't be excessive. Find the sweet spot, the mean, nothing too much. And know thyself. You have to work at the moral life. You have to know where your weaknesses and where your strengths are in order to improve. So I'll leave you with the current actual ruin of the Temple of Delphi. And I hope you've enjoyed my lectures on Aristotle.